Thank you all so much. Can you hear me okay? First, a big thanks, of course, to Wyatt and to Barbara, Megan, Adam, all the staff for being so great this conference. I also want to thank Bob Hass. I really enjoyed working with you again, and our very lively workshop. There you are. Yay, us. And also my Sewanee colleagues who have become the truest friends. About a year ago, I found out I was really sick. I never felt sick, but I found out I was very sick. So Sewanee was the first thing that Kent and I had to say no to, and that was pretty tough. But I have a funny story about that, too. I was slated to work with Dave Smith, who has been my editor at LSU for a long time, and called him up, and he was concerned. And then he began to say things like, I know you're going to be tempted to write about this in this way. And it reminded me of that scene. It's Scout Finch's first day at school, and Atticus is sitting at the head of the table saying about it when his daddy gave him his first gun. And he said sooner or later he supposed the temptation to go after birds would be too much. So I guess the temptation to go after my own experience with the cancer was going to be a little bit too much. I ended up having the surgery, I think the first week of the Sewanee Conference last year. I made out fine, but then I found out I was faced with 6 months of chemotherapy, which I know some of you in the room know what I'm talking about. I had 12 treatments in all. And hey, what are you going to do? I mean, getting chemotherapy is a little bit like getting a whipping, except they take you behind the woodshed every other week and whip you. But while you're getting the whipping, you don't feel it. You're going to feel it about 3 days later. So while you're there in the chemotherapy place, you have time to fake it that you're at work. Have you noticed if you answer an email immediately, they think you're at work? I recommend it. You can get away with a lot this way to avoid taking medical leave. But anyway, so I'm there getting infused for 6 to 8 hours. And so, because it's me, I'm going to write some poems about it. And I opted to write one for every time I went to the chemotherapy place. I wrote them in the time I was there, which I've never done before as a writer. So it was a little bit of a risk. I call it Infusion Suite, and each one carries the number for the time I went there. They're 13ers, so they're short, and I'm only going to read half of them. And I thought about it. They tell us it's better to wait and write these things from memory, but I suppose I really didn't want to remember it any better way than these 13ers. And I guess all you need to know from the first one is that when the nurses are about to infuse you, they have to protect themselves with these protective garments because the stuff is so poisonous. 1. The nurse puts on her protective gown for this one, sky blue, crepe paper-like. She asks again for me to verify name, date of birth, checking what I say against the information on the small plastic bag she shows to me before hanging it upside down. Its contents impossibly clear, benign looking as water coursing the clearest bore, umbilical-like, that almost invisible line. The trees outside the tall window appear still full with summer. Crow's flight, more like drunken tumbling, something to see, while I agree that yes, this is me. 2. The poplars outside this place an old stand, their trunks rise, slender nudes that sway in a rush of wind and sun. At the tree's edge, someone has hung feeders to distract us from ourselves, and so I don't look at her when she says to the screen of her computer that my blood numbers are good. Better, in fact, than last time. Hour after hour, we watch birds circle. The plastic cylinders of sunflower seed cling to the caged cakes of suet swinging from tall, hooked poles, not unlike ours, I like to think. Their source of flight, gravity measured, a given, too, and we are all radiant with it. I discovered that surgery is charismatic. You'll hear from everybody. I'm just sort of a mild Presbyterian, and even they get worked up and bring lots of casseroles and things. But once the surgery's over and you go into the chemo, the river of casseroles kind of dried up, we noticed. 3. The surgery was a flash fire in the yard. Folks nearly delirious with rakes and hoses, their faces hot with it. This place is the slow burn they watch, if they do, at a safer distance, as they might a neighbor's field, smoldering, glad it's not their own, their concern now, the direction of the wind, a chance of rain. 6. The trees redden beneath it before loss, becoming livid with this. Rain, cold, windless, shadowless. The light, the sky a low opalescence. This one a quieter day, the room empties earlier. I eat a bowl of soup from the table I make of my lap. Later I will win at Scrabble, studying my sorry trough of letters. Calls, double its worth, though, and I puzzle it with us, as in Job, as in the land of. Triple, cheating, really, but we agree. We will let it go this time. All my words, small but costly, and my accounting of them perfect. Remember when the Mayan calendar was going to run out and everybody was freaking out? Well, there's one thing about being in chemotherapy. We don't want it, but we don't want to miss it. And the Mayan calendar be damned, we're all lined up with our lunch pails and everything. Might run out, but we were getting our chemo. This one is number 10. The Mayan calendar ran out a week ago, and still this year ends on what we insist is an eve. The day ledge-like, gate-like, a transom. A man in the waiting room opens a penknife and begins to scrape away at what I have mistaken for his palm. A lottery ticket. Scratch and win. And he is delirious with it. This small chance. Why not? All. One more of these, and then I'll switch gears. This is the penultimate chemo treatment, number 11. We have come in from what was earlier predicted to be ice. The steady pour instead washing away last scraps of snow. The man across the way opens his lunch, a block of cheese, saltines, a jar of sweet pickles. He chooses from among them thoughtfully. The excess syrup he lets drip back into the jar before removing his choice from the blade of his penknife. All this tires him. When he is finished, he covers his eyes with his jacket's empty sleeve. I see, it is too easy a metaphor, and though nothing will wake him all afternoon, I will not mistake his loosely sleeved sleep for anything else. I got interested, a couple of years ago in a little series of poems. I didn't know how big it would be, but things I called early elegies. and I was just looking around the world for things I thought would go away, but weren't gone yet. I didn't want to do the retro thing exactly, so I might have made some mistakes in my choices, but they could be anything from an object to an activity, anything that I thought might be on the brink of going away. I limited myself. I'm a counter. I think my students know this by now. I limited myself. These are 8 lines, and I limited myself to 8 of them. The first one is for the word headmistress, I guess. Some of you know I had experience with a girls' school. Emily knows this too. We've talked about this. But this one was inspired by a portrait of a headmistress at the Foxcroft School in Virginia. And I went to do a poetry reading there, and the old headmistress's portrait is above the fireplace, which you'll hear, but I have to kind of try to imitate what's so weird about it. She's posed like this. Right? And that's all you see is this lovely above-the-waist portrait. Headmistress. The word itself, prim, retired. Its artifact, her portrait above the fireplace. On her face, the boredom she abhorred, then perfected. Her hands held upward, their emptiness a revision. Cigarette and brandy snifter painted intolerably out. To leave her this lesser gesture, what next, or whatever. From the waist down, she was never there. I have a little secret writing studio in Fredericksburg, Virginia, and I go down there sometimes just for form's sake and don't do much of anything, as you'll tell from this poem, except look out into a little dead courtyard that my study overlooks. And then I look into Mr. Burgess's barber shop. And he's not very busy, and sometimes neither am I. So I wrote an early elegy barber. Scissors and straight razors he keeps honed in case. Sits in one of the chairs facing a wall of empty mirrors, reflecting mirrors behind him. The backs of his head, one after the shrunken, redundant other. Finally, with a towel, he covers the television screen mounted on the wall the way he might, nearing the end of day, a parakeet in a cage. This one I could be wrong about. I chose drive-in movie theater. I have a feeling there's still some out and about doing pretty well. Maybe they'll hang on, I'm not sure. But I had to write one mainly for the one, it was right over the Virginia line into North Carolina. When I was a girl, people would go over there to go to the drive-in theater because they showed porno, like right at the end of the era. It was the most bizarre thing. I only went there once. I was like, I'm not coming back here anymore. But the funniest thing about it was that the drive-in movie theater was called the South. I just couldn't resist it. So early elegy drive-in movie theater. One of the last was the South. The owner resorted finally to X-rated films and an all-girl staff at the concession stand, where a man would wait in line for a sweaty bottle of beer and a pricey bucket of wings, his car parked beneath the screen filled with the sky-high obvious he would pretend in that obscene exchange he did not see. One more of these. This one was inspired by a story I heard on NPR that smallpox is still around and it's stored somewhere. I've forgotten the story now, but it's still in the world, but saved in some storage place. And I actually found myself feeling a little bit sorry for smallpox, that it's trapped somewhere. But anyway, it turns out, I forget the last person who died from it was a medical photographer, a woman, and that got my attention. So in my imagination, she was photographing smallpox and then she was infected. That's not true. She was actually on the telephone above it when somehow she contracted it, but I just stuck with the idea that she's photographing the entrapped smallpox. The world has certified itself rid of all but the argument to eradicate or not the small stock of variola frozen, quarantined, a dormancy it has refused just once for a woman behind a sterile lens, her glass slide a clearest, most becoming pane. How could it resist slipping away with her that discreet first pock? We'll shift gears again. I've always enjoyed being in the company of older people all my life. And maybe as I age, I'll be less attracted to it. I don't know. But I grew up in a very small town in Southern Virginia, and my father ran a business there, and I just loved his older friends and the way they would come and hang around the store. I liked their stories, everything about them. So little group from, I think, my next book that I'm calling The Opposite House. As I've been telling my students, as the week goes on, I know I'm late in the week and everyone's tired, I begin to feel I'm doing so many things wrong, and I believe I'm suffering from the suffocating third person in these that we heard about. But anyway, actually my ex-mother-in-law inspired this poem. I loved her very much, and she had 3 children who lived and are still alive as far as I know, but she had one little baby who died, and she never got to see him because she was ill after she had given birth to him. So this one is for her. I don't know why I choose to tell you things that will not appear in the poem. I'm not in these. I decided to stay out of them. I call it ephemeris. The household sells in a morning, but when they cannot let the house itself go for the near nothing it brings at auction, the children, all beyond their middle years, carry her back to it, the mortgage now a dead pledge of patience. Almost emptied, there is little evidence that she ever lived in it. A rented hospital bed in the kitchen where the breakfast table stood, a borrowed coffee pot, chair, a cot for the daughter she knows and then does not. But the world seems almost right. The near familiar curtainless windows, the room neat, shadow severed, her body's thinness like her gowns a comfort now. Perhaps she thinks it death, and the place a lesser heaven, the hereafter a bed, the night to herself, rain percussive in the gutters, enough. But like hers, the light sleep of spring has worsened, forsythia blooming in what should be deep winter outside the window until it resembles the shallow sleep of a house with a newborn in it. A middle child she never saw, a boy who lived not one whole day, an afternoon, an evening, 60 years ago in late August. And as though born without a mouth like a summer moth, he never suckled and was buried without a name. She had waked to that cusp of summer, crepe myrtles, clotted blooms languishing, anemic, the cicadas exuberant as they have always been in their clumsy dying. This middleborn is now the the only child. The undertaker's wife has not bathed and dressed him. The first day's night instead has passed, quickening into another day and another, and he is again awake, his fist gripping a spindle of turned light, and he is ravenous in his cradle of air. My ex-father-in-law also appears, although you won't know that from the poem that he's related to me, but he was an amputee from World War II. He lost his leg in the Battle of Monte Cassino. He was a canine in the Canine Corps. He was a scout. So he lived all of his life as an amputee, was around his struggles with that quite a bit. Neither here nor there, but at that time the VA was not the best with the veterans who were missing limbs. I think the patent on his leg for many years was from the Civil War, the hanger patent. Anyway, he was not the best father. He tried, but he was not the best father. I call the poem Charting the Particulars. He reads it every morning. Like a map maker, he must plot extremes before he can focus on details. And the extreme of every day is that the leg is gone. Stubborn surprise because the brain has never accepted it and still sends down the most ludicrous of commands: an itch on the missing shin, tickle on the arch of a foot gone 50 years. Details come down to rash, pinch, bruise, any flaw that might prevent him from wearing the thing that leans in the corner by the bed, ready before him in yesterday's sock and shoe, knee locked, bucket yawning like the mouth of a catfish landed and gaping. Some days, in charting the particulars, it reminds him of one of his children, newborn, before he had reason to dislike it. He knew, of course, that it was his, but found it alien anyway, small, pale, hairless, as this small thing made hairless and pale. And he held it the way he holds this now, at arm's length, gently in his two hands, finding nothing familiar at all, touching it tenderly this same way. I had an Uncle Bill who survived. I can't remember all the things about World War II. He survived, but he made it through a lot of stuff. And I always found it inexplicable somehow that he survived all that and then came home and went to work in the Dan River Mills at home. And that's all he did the rest of his life. I never saw Uncle Bill except in two outfits. He worked third shift at the mill, so if ever I saw him, he was in his pajamas on a Sunday afternoon or in his National Guard uniform on the weekends when he would come and see us. So this one is inspired by him choosing finally to work third shift. One thing, the Dan River Mills, it's gone now, but they used to release the dye into the river. So you could always tell what color they were dyeing anything by the color of the river. Third, he survived the first beach landing and an entire world war for this. The textile mill, buildings looming over the river, windows painted black during the war so they could run the third shift he came to choose. Easier, he found, to black out the days, shutter them, so that the hours that had been for drinking or dreams he could better sleep through to wake evenings for cigarettes and coffee. The trick, not to wake too much. Avoid the gaze of the face in the mirror as he shaved it. Watch static on the television screen or the crosshairs of a test pattern. Nights were easier, bright and loud, rooms the size of airplane hangars, close as circus tents, dye room, spinning room, his, the weave room, voiceless, lit with sound, rows of looms, their ceaseless weft and warp, shuttles, swift, percussive, clawhammer-like, air thick with the smell of cotton, lint in their lungs, their hair, sheeting like dyed, transfigured fields or fields bleached to blinding, a collective shroud. Graveyard shift made them all equal, orphaned. Those with families saw them Sundays, afternoon its own ghost. It was easier to bear what no one else wanted, a world just lightning when his shift ended, the river they all crossed, running with the night's die. My mother, I'm going to read a poem about her in a little bit, but she still lives in my hometown by herself. She's 88. It's kind of funny to watch old people as they age and how their friendships change depending on who's making it, right? You can't be so picky when the numbers start to get smaller and smaller and smaller. So she actually became pretty good friends with a woman she didn't like at all when I was growing up. But anyway, this woman was known to run around a little bit, and she drank and smoked and did a lot of things that my parents weren't very into. So I couldn't help but write about her, though, because it's not funny. I know it's not funny, but toward the end of this woman's life, she would be convinced that she was already dead. So she would start calling people up on the phone to see if she could get anyone to convince her that she wasn't. So everybody would talk about, is this being taped? I don't want to say her name. Has anybody heard from Reba today? Does she think she's dead? So I know some of you have been teasing me also about killing snakes in my work. I'm sorry, there is another snake death in this poem. I'm sorry. Bless you. I call it, and do you know what a setting egg is? You put the egg in the nest to try to convince the hen that it's a good idea to lay eggs. So that appears in the story. It's in 2 sections. Entrance. Some evenings, her own house convinces her she is already dead. Photographs framed portals into which she sometimes falls awake in another room. The phone is silent in its cradle, food tasteless, even salt dumb grains of glass. She calls someone who does answer, but a voice cannot convince her otherwise. The self dead she was who called another woman's husband with an innocent question, the excuse to hear his voice. The self who would have had a cigarette about now, the lighter in a drawer here somewhere, her initials engraved, a flourish of cursive. She craved the sound of the thumb wheels scrape against flint, small flame, that first long drag, the practiced rings of smoke she formed with a mouth painted to disappear behind them. The glass of driest sherry cannot persuade her, though she drinks it anyway. Her hair, her fingernails, her nakedness against the naked floor, the body unbathed for days, some days not enough. 2. Too small to see into the upper nests, she feels the sleeve of its body well muscled with eggs. She knows her mother's fury will not only be at the eggs lost, but at the setting egg devoured also, a doorknob of oblonged, crazed porcelain meant to trick the hens into laying. She would have tried to kill the snake anyway, but now has to be more certain of it, lifting out the stuporous body and quickly, deftly severing the head, offensive mouth with a paring knife, the way she has been taught. She massages out a fluid, wasteful braid of whites and yolks, shell-specked, what would have been more than enough, she thinks, for a pound cake, before the knob at last falls with a thud, like anything but an egg, to the ground. Small, insistent entrance to another house, any house, a painted door, and all to herself, one fool room. had a variety of jobs before I settled on the poetry route. One of them was running a used bookstore many years ago in Danville, Virginia. And I had one customer I loved a lot. His name was Milton Adams. And I've tried to write about him many times. He drove an old Fury car, which was really good for him because he was angry all the time. And I'd see Milton would drive up in the Fury. But he was quite the book collector and an interesting man. He always wore a seersucker suit year-round. I really did care for him. But he was haunted all his life, as the poem will tell you, by a worry that he had. His father had lost everything in the crash. Which crash would it have been? The first one? We just had one, but whatever. And it jumped out the window, right? And evidently, as the poem will tell you, Milton might have seen it, but he doesn't know. He doesn't remember it. And does everybody know what a frontispiece is in a book? The sort of ornamental, yeah. A frontispiece. The hallways, too, have become narrowed with first editions, forgotten histories, novels, rare volumes of verse, some hand-sewn, stitches, machine fine, spines still tightly bound. He can recall where he found each title, what he paid, how much he gained or lost in the purchase. This late delight, though, a frontispiece, a page translucent with age, its ornament meaningless as frostwork inside a window, wordless entrance where he finds himself lingering, almost as though outside the house closing in around him. Not quite a year, he had been old enough to stand but not walk, and they found him upright, gripping the bars of the crib, looking calmly, they told him, over the railing, not at them, but at the window opened to a world he could not yet have perceived as below. He would never be able to recall how old he was when they first told him of the suicide, or even who told him, his mother or one of the aunts. The most important and agreed upon detail to all of them, the fact of his presence in the room from which his father leapt, falling how many stories to the street. Perhaps he had been asleep and seen nothing, they said, and had awakened to voices wafting in on October light. Or perhaps he thought the man had leaned over the crib, looking for last reason, before disappearing into the child's perception, air that did not yet possess gravity, or language, or despair. Here's the one that I couldn't resist writing about my mother. I know it's a little bit lighter, but I told her I was going to read it. Of course, she's seen the sort of Hallmark version of this poem, and she can share it with her friends. But my mother, as I said, she's all that's left of us now besides Kent and me. She lives by herself. She's got still at home, and she has a satellite dish. And so she's got a channel, and she watches Westerns all day long. Pretty much all day. She likes politics too, but she'll switch it off, go right back to the Westerns. My mother watches Westerns. She chooses the known, wild, tired now. The plots formulaic. And she knows them the way she knows her pound cake and spoon bread, things she might never make again but can recite. Ingredients and measurements exact as the words of the Apostles' Creed, she says to herself on a Sunday morning. And she prefers the ones in black and white and shades of gray, dust, tumbleweed, stampedes, rattlesnakes, some savages, a drinking hole now and again, the posse of saloons, swinging doors, the star pinned to the chest of James Arness, who in life and now in death refuses to be old. The time will pass, and the sun will set beneath the sill of her kitchen window, her sink dry sometimes for an entire day, while every hour on the hour means the beginning of another episode she has already seen, the West not yet won, thank God, and nothing settled. I always said to my students, you're either writing on the subject or off it. I don't know if I'm the first one who said that. I don't think so. But again, I limited myself to those poems about the chemo, but I did become really interested over the last year in the history of anesthesia. You're going to be put to sleep, you might as well know what's going on. So I started to poke around about the history of anesthesia and ran into some pretty interesting things about a doctor in the 19th century in Georgia named Dr. Crawford Long. And what I'm about to read to you is in his voice as I imagine it. And I decided to read it in part because I had made up my mind some years ago I would never again write persona. So there you go. It's a lesson in humility that you might be led to do the thing you said you'd never do again. But he became interested in putting people to sleep to operate on them because he was inspired by these gatherings they had called ether frolics in the 19th century, and they'd get together and do some quilting and huff some ether and have a good time. And so he actually experimented first on a white person, according to what I could find, a friend of his. But then he became faced with having to prove that the ether was actually what was working and he wasn't mesmerizing the people, which was also another popular way of well, they thought that might work, to put people to sleep. Okay, I think that's all you need to know. Although I have to say it's a horrible thing what he does in this poem, although people of color, women, the incarcerated, the mentally disabled have often been sacrificed for medical advancement. Dr. Crawford Long, discoverer of the first surgical anesthetic, and the case of Esom Bailey, Jefferson County, Georgia, 8 January 1845. Again, it's in his voice, carries a little epigraph from Paul Simon. Medicine is magical, and magical is art, the boy in the bubble, and the baby with the baboon heart. I had already performed the experiment, removed a tumor from the neck of a friend, James Venable. When he woke, he thought I had not yet begun. I had to show it to him, big as a quail's egg, let him touch the fresh, wet stitches. The hand of God came later when a neighbor woman brought me a boy called Esom, one of her slaves, 2 fingers ruined from a burn she had neglected. Needless loss, had she brought him to me sooner, I might have been able to save them. But mortification had set in, and she was worried now about the loss of the arm, more than half the value of a boy in the bargain. The only implement needed was the metacarpal blade. I recall its mirror finish, particularly bright in January light. I recall the quiet, almost unnerving. This was the simplest of amputations, though, taking off a finger just above the knuckle, and I worked at the same speed I would have had he been awake. No need to linger in it. When I roused him to the news that it was already gone, he didn't believe me, and I had to show him the hand, the finger itself, and still he did not quite believe. But perhaps I had mesmerized him, skeptics would say, the mere suggestion of ether-laced cloth placed like a shroud over his nose and mouth, enough to cast a simple black child into a stupor. And so, to demonstrate that he was not merely suggestible to me, I removed the other finger without it. He felt it, of course, as I knew he would, and I found myself working even more quickly to hasten it, though I was accustomed to such displays of pain, and knew his would be brief, that small bone insensible, easy to prune as wisteria at the root. His owner signed a certificate of witness, and Esom would talk about it for the rest of his life. Those small, neatened nubs, stories he would always tell apart. The fingers consumed, not by one, but 2 fires. One, he could feel and hear the searing cut, pull, quick snapping pass of the blade. The other, deathless, dreamless, oblivion, sleep that refused measure. I suppose it might be compared to the womb. Known place and time no one can recall and so can never forget, where fingers are knit, webbed to the hand, Esoms for this, and this was no experiment, but a miracle by design, a proof like a Lazarus, and I had performed it. I was, again, poking around about some of these things. I think I just have 3 more poems for you all tonight. This one I call Limb Factory, the Hanger Limb Factory. There's one of them in Richmond, Virginia, where I'm about to move. And I'm interested in, I suppose, interchangeable parts and the restoration of the body in times of war and how that industry sort of kicks into another gear. It carries an epigraph from Ezekiel chapter 37. The hand of the Lord was upon me and carried me out in the spirit of the Lord and set me down in the midst of the valley which was full of bones and caused me to pass by them round about. And behold, there were very many in the open valley, and lo, they were very dry. And he said unto me, Son of man, can these bones live? And I answered, O Lord God, thou knowest. Despite the seeming singularity of the fetal sonogram, the wonder or despair at a murky, undeniable first, an avoided or longed for windfall last, perhaps all of it has been like this: mass production, an assembly line, the demand a given, though more in this place, in times of war, the industry of it, a study in loss, and the argument against it, the physics and engineering of what moves, recovers, resists, and follows the body's original order, the flux and give of a gathering of dust, reproduced, piecemeal, a room for arms, legs, someone's specialty, the knee, the foot, someone's the hand. And perhaps such survival has always been part conjure, part clinical, the muscle twitch of quickening, a fashioned thing, interchangeable, abject, this remembrance, not begotten, made. Jill's talk the other day brought up the idea of scars and narrative. When I was a younger teacher, I used to give an assignment to tell the story of a scar, and honestly, it just became too painful to read them after a while. But this one, I think those folks from Cincinnati have heard. I actually wrote this in Cincinnati last year. My only brother, died from a worse cancer than the one I had in 2006. So that's part of the context of the poem, but I loved my brother very much, but when we were little, he did not like me at all. I think that's probably normal, just the 2 of us, really despised me, actually. So this poem is about a little scar I have right here, and I call the poem Blood Groove. You know, in a knife, you have the groove along the blade so the blood can drain down. It's a hunting knife. My mother was the scout leader. So anyway, I think that tells you everything you need to know about this one. Blood Groove. My brother was angry. I understand that now. The Boy Scouts my mother led, all trying to build fires inside circles she had taught them to make of stone. With no choice but to bring me with her, she left me alone to gather my own stones and tinder. I recall dry grass and twigs, skeletal leaves, the small cardboard drawer with the one wooden match I was allowed, the rasp of the strike. My fire the first to blaze, and with such brightness I could not help but call out from it to my mother, to all the boys. He drew his knife, held it by the tip, then threw it for all he was worth, shaft and blade, blood groove and bone handle sailing end over end until it found the outer orbit of my left eye, where I will always be able to measure the size of its strike, the depth of its impression, that of a grain of rice. I never asked and will never know what were his chances, what was his aim, by how much he might have missed his mark, or how close he came. All right, one more. This is the biggest risk of the night, but I thought, okay, it's Sewanee, that's fair. If you've heard me read before, you know I write a lot. I have written a lot about my father, who lived to be almost 94. I loved him very much. He became fairly demented toward the end of his life. At any rate, time goes by, and I'm dragging. I know some of you do this. You drag around notes forever with some idea of how you might write about a family member, and I think I finally can share at least one from what I think I might write next about my father. Let's see. I think that's all I need to tell you, except that his name was Claude. And I call him Claude in these poems. The working title for the thing I carry around on my computer is Claude Before Time and Space. He was born in 1914, which I think is a very important year, right, to come into the world. But at any rate, I don't have a title for it yet. And this will be my final poem. Claude has a recurring dream after the open heart surgery, and he tells it as though you are having it too. He says he has had that dream, the one where the garden goes awry, blooms out all wrong, deepening before you, tomatoes where onions should be, crows there but shy, dirt on your hands as though you had something to do with it. And then you arrive at the place where it all begins to make sense again. Beans climbing the threads you pulled taut for them, potatoes neat in their beds. And when you feel you could wake up, you do. Even this part, he tells with his hands out before him, as though blinded, parting something invisible to you. The chaos of dying, the random legacy of seed. You will bear no children. In you, he sees an end. And that's why you need to hear this. Thank you.